Well, good morning everybody, and welcome to this, the first session of the last day of the National Housing Conference. Begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. Today we are looking at the topic of planning and design in relation to housing. We've heard a lot over the last couple of days of the conference about supply and the need to increase the supply of housing. And some of that dialogue has also included the reference to planning reform and changes to streamline planning processes. But what we want to focus on in this particular and very important session is the really positive and important role that both planning and design play in housing provision. So beyond the issue of providing affordable and secure housing for growing populations, planning and design do indeed play a major role to ensure that housing is also appropriate for households in terms of its quality, its performance, its location and its fit to their particular household. Land use planning is one of the activities of government that can have a huge impact on what housing is supplied and where. And in the context of a housing crisis, where housing, and particularly affordable housing, is in short supply, it can be tempting to remove perceived constraints on the market and to focus the activities of planning entirely on the issue of expanding supply. Quite apart from the question of whether this approach is likely to have that desired effect and the risk of unintended consequences as a result, it also fails to consider opportunities that active planning intervention can create and the positive outcomes that it can help to deliver. And the same is also true of architecture and design. Despite growing evidence of the value and the benefits that good design can deliver and the new possibilities that it can help to open up, design continues to be treated often as a nice-to-have or an expendable luxury rather than as a fundamental aspect of the success of new housing provision. These are the issues that we're going to grapple with in this session, and I'm just going to quickly introduce each of our panellists and then invite them to come and present to you. Our first presenter will be John Brockhoff from the Planning Institute of Australia. John's a registered planner and he's a policy advisor in housing, cities and infrastructure planning. He's the National Policy Director and a Fellow of the Planning Institute, as I mentioned. He guided the preparation of the Planning Institute's policy positions on the role of planning in housing, in climate change and in infrastructure funding, and in PIA's call for a national settlement strategy. And then following John, we'll have David Islip. David is a principal advisor at the Office of the Victorian Government Architect. He's an architect with over 25 years of experience in both the public and private sectors, and he advocates for the benefits of good design. David is the OVGA's design lead for the state's public housing renewal program, which is being delivered as a ground lease model, which we've heard about in a couple of the other sessions through the conference. Then our third speaker is a little different from what was in your program, and we had Llewellyn Reynders from Infrastr Victoria in the program. You will have seen, unfortunately he was unable to join us, but we are very thrilled to have Tess Pickering as part of this session today. Tess is the Deputy Director General of Planning for the Queensland Government, and she's obviously a planner. Before taking up this particular role, she is a Queenslander, but she also worked in Victoria for a while as part of the Victorian Planning Authority. And after we've heard those presentations, we will have a panel discussion, and we'll kick that off with Amy Degenhart, who is a Life Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and the Chapter President of the Institute of Architects in Queensland. Amy was also recently appointed to the Queensland Housing Supply Expert Panel to provide insights into the challenges of housing supply and affordability in Queensland. So that's our lineup, and we're looking forward to hearing from them. John, can you come and kick us off? Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much, and good morning. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagera people, and respect that we've got a long, long way to travel further together. I'd like to talk about planning not just being a sausage machine for housing supply. It's so much more, its role is so much greater than enabling more housing. It's about creating great places that work for all aspects of our lives and our economy. But before I get too deeply into it, what is planning? It's a way we make decisions for places that reflect our priorities and make the best trade-offs spatially. We plan for better places to live, obviously with capacity for a growing and changing population. We plan for better bang for buck, for a better return on our investment in infrastructure and services. And we plan for housing that meets our needs, that's well located, and interestingly well located is used many times in the National Housing Accord. And obviously well located refers to design and our response to climate. The regulatory tools of planning, and zoning is just one of them, don't get hung up on zoning. The regulatory tools of planning serve these outcomes. They don't lead. The entire reason we have a whole range of regulatory tools in planning is to serve those outcomes. And they should be applied, the regulatory tools of planning should be applied with the lightest touch necessary to achieve those outcomes. A key role of planning is to ensure that cities and towns accommodate growth and respond to changing needs. So that's where housing comes in, of course. There's no doubt we need more housing. Modelling undertaken by NIFIC suggests that there's a substantial shortfall in net housing supply, something over 100,000 homes over the 5 years to 2027. And significantly, most of the shortfall is in apartments and medium density dwellings. But we need to reset the housing conversation towards improving access to the right housing in the right place, recognising that access to shelter is a fundamental human right. But recognising access to housing also is not just a welfare issue, it's a productivity issue. I mean, let's be clear, chronically unaffordable housing manifests itself with a range of productivity implications on our cities: loss of talent, loss of potential for innovation, foregone opportunities for agglomeration economies to thrive. The Committee for Sydney looked at Sydney and recently published an evaluation that chronically unaffordable housing has a real cost in the order of $10 billion a year in terms of lost benefits for those reasons. And that's a substantial portion of Sydney's GDP. And I expect proportionally it's comparable in other Australian capitals. But to explore the role of planning and design in improving the suitability of our housing supply, we need to first ask the questions, well, which housing problems can planning actually solve? And I personally, and the Planning Institute, really recoil when we see discussion of a single housing crisis. Oh, we've got a housing crisis. Oh, we've got a supply solution. That's where the argument goes. We have lots of housing crises, all stacked on and shuffled amongst each other. Leaping the deposit hurdle to afford a deposit on a house that's further out of reach. Having access to affordable rental housing for low and moderate income earners. Having housing that works in its suburban context doesn't cost so much to live in and gives you access to great services and jobs and amenities. There are at least 3 different housing crises that we've faced. All of them have different answers, and planning has a role differently in each of them. Planning won't make the price of housing, the price of a home to buy or rent in the private market, more affordable very quickly. No amount of targets, planning approvals, or realistic rates of completion can do that. And the qualifier is while investment and other demand-side pressures are so superheated in the market. And let's bear in mind that over 95% of housing applications are approved in every jurisdiction, but only about half to three-quarters of these are built. And almost for most of the last 2 decades, supply production has tracked above rates of population growth, at least until COVID. All the while, house prices have steadily trended upwards. Another important element is much of the growth in private market housing supply has been taking place in the mid to high price segments rather than the lower price segments of the market. And this points to structural impediments to trickle down of new housing supply. And clearly, it talks to a role for government in addressing the adequate supply of affordable housing. And I'm just referring here to some work by Rachel Long et al. And through Ahuri, done some time ago, but it shows that much of the growth in private housing stock is occurring on the right-hand side of that graph in the moderate and higher deciles. And while it doesn't show, it points to this issue around how private supply is not trickling down to that which is affordable, particularly in the context of such superheated demand pressures. I guess, obviously supply does have an impact on price. How sensitive that is in different situations varies, of course. And while demand is so superheated, the effect is less. But how strong is the effect in any case? And in relation to rental, and according to analyses by the Grattan Institute, the inclusion of an additional 200,000 homes upon their full completion holds the potential to curtail rental cost growth by only 4% compared to the projected levels. So I'd put to you that housing supply is really important to make sure that our housing stock matches our future growth needs at a generational scale, but its short-term effect on price is overstated. And you only have to look at the price effects of small changes in interest rates, as mentioned by the Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, Lucy Ellis, in the Felinsky inquiry, to look at what tune house prices really dance to. So bringing it back to planning, what positive effect can planning really play beyond enabling quantities of housing in the private market? It can enable more households to have access to a roof over their heads in places where there are jobs, services, friends or family. And there are 3 important themes that where planning does make a difference. Diversity and good design. Planning has an enormous role in encouraging housing diversity in high amenity locations where there's jobs, transport and infrastructure. And it does this by de-risking those types of development proposals, incentivising them, and creating a certain pathway for development investment. But it can't change the fundamental land economics. It does reduce unnecessary costs for medium and high density housing and provides and can provide a more streamlined pathway for housing diversity. And it certainly can foster good design and sustainability, not just at the household scale, but at the urban design of cities and suburb scales. And over time, it can make our private housing stock better match our changing household needs and focus on ensuring our stock creates more livable places that enjoy a greater amenity, access to open space, jobs, and ensures that we have a better return on our investment in infrastructure and services. Others will talk about the designs, planning and design's role in terms of individual houses and how they respond to a changing climate and how they perform. Planning also has a key role in enabling housing for those in need. It can improve access to affordable and social housing, provide assessment pathways that benefit housing that provides the greatest benefit. It can provide streamlined pathways for social housing, mandatory inclusionary zoning or incentive pathways for affordable housing. And it can help and de-risk new models for urban renewal. And I guess lastly, it's critical in terms how we get together and make decisions for our cities. planning has an enormous role in how we engage and build the community's authority for decisions on how we change our cities, how we invest in long-term strategic planning, how we bring aligned strategic planning and government priorities into decision-making on the uses of land and on particular developments, and particularly how we depoliticise planning decisions. And it also has a role in ongoing improvement, measurement and responsiveness to the outcomes that we want and a feedback into the priorities we have for our cities through improving data quality, availability and the circularity of our policy process. So I'd like to finish with the role of planning is so much more than a sausage machine for housing supply in the private market. No matter how much faster we grind the sausage machine or red tape we cut, housing won't become much cheaper in the short run. But the supply that planning does enable must be fit for purpose for the long run. Indeed, there are so many other factors that affect the price of housing, whether it be labour and construction material shortages, interest rate settings, tax settings, and the long-term underinvestment by governments in social and community housing. But let's get back to planning. And I think the key point that I'd like to make is there's no point sacrificing the good things that planning can deliver for something that can't. Planning shapes the location of housing over the long term. It doesn't determine the exact time or commencement or speed of completions. And while we can and must improve planning systems and reduce red tape and planning regulation to the lightest touch possible to enable those outcomes to be achieved, ultimately, good planning should be motivated by achieving outcomes for places and people, addressing long-term housing needs, and in doing so, certainly it will have effect on housing supply, and that will be very significant over generations to ensure that we maintain a match between our changing population and household needs and our overall housing stock. So just to conclude, planning has a role in many housing crises. It's not just get out of the way, we need more supply. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, John. David Islip is from the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, and I'd invite him now to talk about his role and the Government Architect's role in the delivery of the public housing renewal projects in Victoria. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Tom, and good morning. I acknowledge too the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagara people of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. If design is to have a role in housing, it needs to be valued. Good design is not an optional extra, nor should it be perceived as gold plating. For Australia to mature beyond, as architect Robin Boyd put it, the Australian ugliness, a culture of design needs to be embedded in the values of a nation and, where possible, in policy. Just last year in Spain, a new law was brought in on architectural quality. And this law stipulates that architecture is an asset of public interest because of its contribution to the creation of cultural identity, quality of life, well-being, social cohesion and inclusion. It is because of health, its link to the protection of the safety and health of workers, consumers and users, its relevance for mitigating the effects of climate change and adapting to it, as well as economic importance. Currently, 26 administrations in the European Union have an official architecture policy at a national or a regional level, including Iceland, Norway and Switzerland. In Australia, there are only 2 states, New South Wales and WA, that have architecture policies in place. Their commitment to a design culture is further evidenced in the apartment design standards, where the bar is appropriately set in these states to ensure internal amenity and also fit-for-purpose homes. To encourage a culture of design, there is a need to understand the different audiences that engage with housing across government, specifically Treasury, who only seem to understand metrics. A publication that our office has put out is called The Case for Good Design, and in it, it captures extensive academic and scientific research that explores the benefits of well-designed places and the effect of poor design on our lives. As links between design and neuroscience, health and human behaviour continue to emerge, it is important that this evidence-based background informs decision-making about the shape, the nature and the function of our cities, buildings and landscapes. At the moment, I'm very much at the coalface of delivery. We face, in Victoria, a new and much welcomed frenzy of activity to deliver social and affordable housing. And yet the method of procurement selected to deliver any housing project will have a significant impact on the quality of that outcome. The images of the buildings in my presentation today are drawn from two recent projects in Ascot Vale and Ashburton in Melbourne. Both were delivered as a design and construct procurement method. Contrasting this, the new ground lease model of procurement in Victoria, which is effectively a public-private partnership, where public land will be leased from Homes Victoria, which is the state delivery agency, to a consortium who will finance, design and construct new housing. The community housing provider will then manage and maintain the sites for 40 years before handing the land and all dwellings back to the state government. Currently, Ground Lease Model 1 is under construction and will deliver 1,100 new dwellings across 3 sites. Ground Lease Model 2 is currently in probity in contract negotiations for another 1,400 new dwellings. Selecting a public-private partnership demands that government is a smart client. And public-private partnerships are not really anything new. If we go back to the very first PPP, which was under Governor Macquarie, where he wanted to build a hospital in Sydney, and he couldn't get England to sufficiently finance that hospital, so it was built by the rum merchants at the time. Francis Greenaway, the very first government architect in Australia, who was a convict because of his crime of forgery, ended up realising that this building was falling down and had to be rebuilt. And so the issue behind that piece of history is, where does the vested interest actually lie? Because a significant risk with a PPP is that it does not necessarily guarantee that the best design will be selected. As observed by previous Victorian Government Architect John Denton, when it comes to choosing bids, money, not design, tends to win out. Further, the rewards for the private sector from a PPP are considerable. The Kensington Housing Project from 2012, piloted in Melbourne as a PPP, saw the private developers collect net profits of more than 37%. So what then of the role of the architect? The role of the architect is to create a design vision in the face of balancing quality against time and cost. Recently, we were told by a project manager, well, you know, OBGA, there's planning and good design, but there's also about being pragmatic. And what that comment suggested to me was that there's this tension that still exists between design quality on one hand and cost and time on the other. Delivering public housing can't just be a political numbers game. Design quality is needed to ensure an asset is being delivered for the state rather than a liability. And this has been ever more evident in the recent decision in Victoria to demolish 44 20-storey public housing towers from the 1960s. Structurally, they are effectively a house of cards. They're unable to be adapted for adaptive reuse, and they are an incredible challenge in terms of their ongoing maintenance and cost to the state. Another challenge for the role of the architect is that since the demise of the Public Works Department in the 1980s, the role of the very few architects who still work in government is the challenge to remain frank and to remain fearless. To advocate for what is actually still in the public interest and to be a smart client. One who can voice what is needed when those who are homeless cannot. The challenge is that architects on both sides of the fence, private and public, are dealing with significant value management from day one as part of a bidding process. So there is a need for architects to demonstrate and articulate why a good design and good master plan will set up a project for actual success. Why efficient building layouts will enhance amenity, and why the orientation of apartments is critical for sunlight and natural ventilation. Architects need to articulate why certain materials are not expensive if one actually understands the whole of life cost for a building. This is even more important for the consortium who has to maintain that asset over 40 years. A key challenge in capturing the lessons learned is to ensure that government delivery agencies start to invest more heavily in the capability and capacity of their design teams. Because only then will they be able to act in the public interest, rather than being constrained by commercial imperatives of external consultants who seem to infiltrate government at increasing levels, with their fixation on time and cost and how to win their next government contract. The future direction for housing, whether public or private, needs to embed the role of design to ensure that we're not delivering product, but rather homes, a common theme from this conference. And the risk of not getting the design fundamentals correct up front can result in a legacy of buildings without the necessary structural bones, such that any notion of adaptive reuse is at best tenuous. Design has to be the foundation of livability, and it must be acknowledged that livability is not the result of economic prosperity, but rather it is the condition for it. A key lesson from recent public projects is that a focus on quality and cost is important, but so is time. With the current fast-tracked and shortened design process that I'm seeing, this will inevitably compromise the quality of housing that we build for the future. Too often, design development as a phase in design can be derailed into being a value management exercise, rather than exploring opportunities to test the design and exploring innovation. And so, without time, we end up with a grub with wings that cannot fly. In summary, my three key points are: firstly, to nurture a design culture to influence better housing outcomes. Secondly, select the right procurement method. And finally, commit to a design-led housing program that ensures the best possible amenity for tenants, and one that is adaptable into the future.
Thank you, David, and I think we all particularly enjoyed that final slide. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to invite Tess Pickering, Deputy Director General of Planning in Queensland, to address us.
Thank you. I got a bit of a late call-up, so I don't have any slides. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of my views that I've really come to realise working both in Victoria and in Queensland. I would like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people and pay my respects as the owners of this land. And also I want to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were indeed the very first land use planners and designers in Australia. And, you know, we've got a big job to, to match the skills of our First Nations community. And of course, I want to acknowledge our Minister for Housing, Minister Scanlon, who I think you heard from yesterday, and also my colleague Debbie McNamara from Economic Development Queensland, who you'll hear from later in the last plenary session. And I acknowledge that you had your dinner last night, so some of you may be a bit tired, and that I'm the third speaker, so I'll try to keep it as light as I can and not go on for too long. But first of all, yes, I want to thank you for having me. I'm the state planner here in Queensland, and I've just recently moved back after 5 years in Victoria. I've also just come back a week ago from maternity leave. My 3-month-old Theodore is at home, so I've had lots of time in the middle of the night for quiet contemplation about the housing challenges that we face and the role of planning. We all know that to have a home to live in, a place to feel safe and connected, is the basic participation right of us in our communities. If you search solution to the housing crisis on Google News, you will get hundreds of results, daily, weekly, and for the last few months. Let's consider, though, some of those headlines. Regarding supply, you will find the following. Supply is the only solution. Supply alone won't fix the crisis. We have enough housing supply. We have an oversupply of housing. Then we move into the tax arguments. There's too much tax. There's not enough tax. We need more tax breaks to spur investment. Investor tax are pushing up rents. Move to short-term rental. You'll go from one article that claims definitively that this is what is causing the crisis, over to the next, which will say the impacts of short-term rental are marginal. Move on to the planning side of the argument. You have to go out. The only solution is to keep going out, you'll read in one spot. Over to the next, where density and infill are the only solution that are put on the table. So, I could go on. What I'm trying to say is that there isn't one reason for the housing crisis. You will find 10 articles that tell you that they know what it is, but not one of them will likely agree. So, before I get into the planning side of things, I just wanted to talk about facts. The overwhelming tendency to approach housing is through data, and I think that aligns with what we've heard from the other speakers today, i.e. that we have to build X many homes over Y years, leaving us with a shortfall of Z. Unfortunately, though, people and places, for a whole range of reasons, do not lend ourselves to algebra. It would be great if we did, but in a planning perspective, I know that we do not. Matters of place have far too many forces. They are complex and they are about people. According to the HIA affordability report from December last year, we now know that it requires nearly 1.6 average incomes to affordably service a mortgage on a median-priced home in Australia, in our cities, and more than 1.4 of your income in the regions. What does this mean, though? I think this means that our successful centres are becoming richer over time, and this is not unusual in the Anglosphere. But we need to acknowledge that that's not solving disadvantage. We're actually exporting disadvantage to surrounding areas of our cities as the price for admission becomes too great. For some time now, that concentric tide has been pushing out, rolling over our suburbs, pushing workers on median incomes, not just modest, not just marginalised, but now a growing cohort of median incomes, basically away from where they grew up and without the choice of where they want to live. Where and how people live must be as important questions as how many homes are needed and how they are delivered. In Queensland, I'm very pleased to work for a government that is committed to making sure that the planning part of this wicked problem is not, creating unnecessary hold-ups on the creation of new homes. We know there's too many Queenslanders who are unable to secure housing at the moment, and we know that we are growing. In South East Queensland alone, we've got 125,000 more people a year coming here. We estimate by 2046 we'll be at 6 million people in SEQ. So we've got a problem, and we've got an exacerbating factor that's going to keep contributing to that problem, and we need to be eyes wide open about that. So yesterday, the Deputy Premier did introduce a new bill into the House, the Housing Affordability and Availability Bill. And basically, that's a package of measures looking to streamline the planning process, but also not trying to fall into the trap that my colleagues have spoken about here today with, opening the floodgates and not actually having the controls around the place and the community that you need to occur. It also forms part of a broader range of packages that the government is looking at, including our Shaping SEQ plan, which just recently underwent consultation. That plan I'm really proud of. It's quite bold. It doesn't go out too much, which is always a tempting solution to supply, and it really does increase the ask on what we call gentle density, which is about diverse housing. It's really about making sure our workers that power our cities are able to afford to live where they want to live, and that's going to need different types of housing than carving up blocks and bigger lot sizes that we tend to see. So we're excited about that bill. We're also very keen to and happy to have a federal government re-engaged in housing, and we are absolutely in the mix with our state colleagues. There's money on the table, which is good, and targets set, which is driving us, and we'll continue to work together to try to, maximise the outcomes for Queensland in that process. We are also investigating closely what we're calling a Distinctly Queensland Design series, because we know that Queensland's climate is a bit different, it's a bit hot, a bit hotter than down south, and so we want to make sure we're aligned with the sorts of housing that we want to see up here. So I'm not going to go on too long. I know that we're going to have a conversation here, but I just really did want to conclude by encouraging you to put all the meta-narratives aside for a little while and focus on the local. So take a walk in almost any neighbourhood across the country, really, and count how many homes are accessible for older people as our nation ages. It's not too many. Think about how many homes are located so that young families only need one car. That's not too many either. Think about what percentage of people you see in your neighbourhood as you walk along the footpath are different from you in income, in life stage, or in background. Lack of diversity in homes, creates a cumulative effect on our housing system. Big structural changes are needed, but we need to address the small stuff too, because putting a roof over someone's head is critical, but also our communities and the places around it allow us to call where we choose to call home. So thank you. I'm very delighted to have been asked to attend and look forward to the discussion with the panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tess. And Amy, I'm going to invite you to respond to what you've heard in just a moment. Before you do, I just want to highlight that we're going to take some questions for the panel. We've got questions coming in from our virtual audience on the iPad here. But those of you in the room, the way to ask a question is simply to put your hand up, and we have people with microphones who will come round and find you. But Amy, you're on the Supply and Affordability Council for Queensland here. What did you think of what you've heard today?
I absolutely applaud and respect all of the concepts brought by the speaker, and I'd like to make a little mind shift change, because I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I'd just like to say that a shortage of housing supply is a great problem to have. It's a bit like having a teenager. There is, as John said, there's no one solution, and so there's just a growing pain, and we're experiencing that. Some of the things that are really close to my heart, to one thing that Tess said, is the gentle density. We talk about that a lot, and I'd like to say that that's kind of part of a spectrum. There's actually, we can start with a low-hanging fruit of invisible density, where it's actually the same, looks exactly like a house, but in fact it might be 2 or 3 or 4 dwellings instead of 1. Then gentle density, which I think we're all understanding. And I think there's another density at the end of this, at the sort of that middle spectrum, and that's actually alternative density, where we're, maybe we expect density to be high, but sometimes it's actually low and it's still just as compact. And that sort of innovation is coming, as David mentioned, through architecture and design. And the value that that adds to the housing spectrum is probably not yet as much appreciated and explored and in many ways utilised. In terms of infill, we're able to use existing infrastructure, which is great. And if we look towards some of the things that Tess mentioned with housing codes, we might be able to go to a straight to the certifier solution in some of these more invisible densities scenarios. And that will, in fact, stop some of the land banking that's often discussed as some of the problems that we have. I wanted to mention the fact that I probably have quite a unique perspective from the point of view of 95% of housing is coming from the private sector. And a lot of our discussion at the moment is about the public sector, naturally, because of legislation that's coming out. In terms of a couple of social housing exemplars that have been around southeast Queensland. I'd like to mention a couple of case studies. Ann Street Garden Villas is a wonderful project in the Gold Coast where I would say that's almost invisible density. It's the collective name. It's a project by Anna O'Gorman Architect, and it's the name for 7 social housing dwellings. We also have another favourite of mine, and all of these are architectural and award-winning projects. Habitat on Jurors. I think that's a gentle density project, and that's in Logan, and 16 adaptable and accessible social dwelling units. And also one that John actually showed earlier, which is the Envy Micro-Urban Village. And that I think might be described as that sort of transitional or alternative housing, where in fact, what you normally think of as high-rise density of 150 dwellings per hectare could actually look like this. So, let's, not put preconceived notions on what density looks like. And I love using that example because it's just so much the bookend. It's not necessarily the solution for neighbourhoods, where 1, 2, 3, or 4 dwellings might be more comfortable on a suburban lot. That was 1 lot, and now it's 10 lots, and delivered in a house and land package. But it's just a wonderful example to demystify density. I'm looking forward to questions, so I'm going to stop there. And I appreciate the opportunity to run through a myriad of my favorites. But let me just say that one of the most important things is that we need to build bundles of housing, but we have to build them better. That's the key. We just have to focus on that quality outcome, that lifestyle outcome.
Thanks, Amy. We appreciate that. I've had a few questions come through on the app. If there are questions in the room, can you put your hand up now, and the people with the microphones will start coming around to you. But David, there's a couple of questions that have come through on the ground lease model that you spoke about in the Victorian context, which perhaps don't go to the question of design so much as, I guess, unpacking a little bit, if we can, just what the model is. But the questions are around, what's the incentive for a community housing provider who often, do provide, very innovative types of development to actually undertake development on land that it won't actually own. And I guess related to that too is another question here around how the private partner is actually, what's in it for them, again, when the land is held by the government.
Yeah, it's a good question because you have to really ask the question. It's a commercial in confidence, often level of detail, but in a general sense, what I would say is that it's the service, kind of the actual service fee that sits behind the operating of that particular infrastructure, of that social housing, whether it's affordable market or private. So what happens on these sites is there's an opportunity for private housing to be part of that site as well. So the actual rents that come from that market private housing supports and underpins the consortia, but you've also got the operating and maintenance of that facility, which then draws down a fee from government over 40 years. So if you were to do the long-term figures on that, that's where I guess it's got the sweetness in the deal.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah. Do we have a question in the room? Yeah, there's one up here. If I can get a microphone over there, quickly. Do we have one ready to go over here as well? It's just down here, that question. And while, did I see a question up there? Yeah, can someone bring a microphone down there too while we're bringing this one? Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name's Yvette Park. I come from Darwin. I work in the Northern Territory Government in housing. I'm not a policy, not a planner or an architect. I work in the policy space, but I've really enjoyed what the panel has said today, and every one of you have triggered a lot of thinking in my mind. I'd like to ask, what role do you think government has in trying to ensure good design and planning outcomes in the delivery of what we're all talking about? The HAF, which is a very high volume delivery space with a lot of different parties and players leading these projects. What ideas do you have to try and ensure that we get really great design outcomes in these assets that benefit communities?
Thanks. Tess, can we go to you first on that one, perhaps?
Sure. I would say I think government, obviously, critical role. It's upon us, in particular, I would say state governments, because each of us set our planning framework differently, but it's incumbent upon us to make sure that is, got the checks and balances to balance releasing land, but making sure it's pushed as hard as it possibly can be in the right locations with good design, in viable ways that mean they actually get developed. So I think the state has a real leadership role, and in negotiating with the federal government in NIFIC and HAF and HIF and all of our various streams, it's incumbent upon all of us, local government too, to make sure we've signed up to that ultimate outcome for the community.
John, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yes. The National Housing Accord comes with two key words: well located. That 1.2 million additional homes has that inverted commas statement to be well located. I think it'd be really useful for the Commonwealth, the planning ministers around the country and the Commonwealth to collaborate on what they mean by well-located outcomes and what they mean in a design sense, to measure it and to hold a degree of accountability around not just achieving the volume target, but achieving the well-located, well-designed element of that.
Yes, I would just update on that. All the chief planners of every state did meet yesterday with the Commonwealth to talk about how we define well located, because of course it's different here as it is in Darwin, and we all need to be comfortable with what that means.
Yeah, and are the states talking among themselves about that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, you see every day, every state is coming up with their own sorts of, different solutions that are broadly similar. We're all trying different ways of the same thing, but I guess what we are really pleased about is often, planning is really political. Yeah. Density is extremely political, and local governments are at the forefront of that in terms of development proposals, and they often get so far and then they fall. And I guess that's that new bill we've introduced, that's pushing it up so that we can all sort of say, all right, this has to happen here, and we can push through the political issues and strive for the place outcome.
And I think that I can look at that question and answer it with two different scales. One is with the procurement for the larger social housing projects with the acronyms that you've just so aptly nominated. And the pressure there is, I think, on keeping design management through the follow-through in the process rather than value management. So design is value, but having those design solutions can actually be a great way to keep the outcome at a high level and still balance those value issues. So encourage the designers to stay on with those larger projects. But the lucky thing is with the larger projects, you usually do have an architect in leading those. In terms of where architecture and design is often, as we heard with the panelists yesterday, I don't like the term, but the dumb density. In terms of learning the lessons of not repeating that, I think with the opportunity to do that sort of gentle density in existing areas particularly, it could be a matter of optional self-certification through registered design professionals holding hands. So if they're involved, perhaps they could opt out of a code assessment. So a very easy process, but giving a little bit of incentive for designers to be, holding hands of either the moms and dads who might be taking these development opportunities on, or the local builders. So that would be a great thing. And one thing, I just want to make sure that I do mention is the opportunity of the modern homes and prefabricated construction, which now, if anyone's seen the examples, there's no sense that that's any lesser of a design aspiration than any other home, and great where there's the opportunity for volume build and or where there's just challenged building environment in remote areas. So we've got a lot of opportunities, and those were architect-led designs as well. So those are some of the solutions. I think government have been great about doing, trying some new, experimenting with some new regulation changes, and we really look forward to more.
Thanks, Amy. I quite appreciated the term dumb density, actually. It called a spade a spade.
I don't want to repeat it, but it was said here, and I must say that it's just something we don't want to look in the traffic lights, but we want to avoid that. But look, if that's what it takes to put the pressure on bringing design along the way, that would be my goal.
We had a question over here, thanks.
Oh, hi. Yeah, Peter Sibley from United Housing Cooperative in Melbourne. The previous questioner stole my thunder a little bit, but I was going to say that I didn't think the PPPs had delivered great design outcomes in some Melbourne developments, and it's a bit worrying that developers seem to be having a leading role in the public housing redevelopments that David alluded to. A bit concerned about that, but I'd be interested to know thoughts on that. But I guess more importantly, we've been trying to advocate for a long time that smaller community housing providers be allowed to redevelop government-owned land, which is well located, close to services, and we need some really good innovative design and planning outcomes to enable that to happen. And I'm just wondering with people on the panel whether they think that sort of redevelopment, infill development, is part of the solution to our current housing crisis, and it could be done really, really well if we had the wherewithal. But for some reason, government's not wanting to embrace that. And I'm just wondering do you think it's part of the solution, and how do we convince governments to do it?
David?
Yeah, I think with that particular issue, a couple of weeks ago in Victoria, we had a change in our planning scheme to do with introducing what's called future homes, which was an initiative that arose out of our office. And the intent behind that is to really focus in on the missing middle in terms of the typology, but also the geographical space within our cities that has been a challenge. And so now in Victoria, if you choose one of those particular designs, which really is similar to what happened with the Robin Boyd small home service some years ago, where you could pick up a set of plans for £5. Well, now you can get a set of plans for $15,000, and you effectively have it as of right within 800 metres of a local train station to do that type of development. So I would encourage any community housing providers to look at that particular model, because that's a really straightforward way in which you can get really fast planning approval. You know what you're getting, the designs have been done, They've been effectively certified by our office and also the Department of Planning. The other point I'd make is going back to your earlier comment around PPPs. Yes, we know they're a challenge, but you really need the grunt of those larger building companies to deliver projects of that scale and the tier of builder required. I think it's just a case of working with that particular consortia to make sure they're held to account. And a key component of PPPs in the brief is the requirement for post-occupancy evaluation. And we don't see that often enough in government. We don't see it in the majority of departments in Victoria, but we do see it in education. So our office often gets involved in post-occupancy evaluation, but it's really critical to see that it will happen in public housing so that we can learn the lessons from what we're building.
We did see quite a bit of quality design and design innovation following the GFC with the stimulus package that went to social housing at that point too, and Ahuri did a bit of an assessment of some of that design innovation and outcomes at that point as well, just also to add to that question. Do we have a question? There's one question right over here. If I can get a microphone on this side of the stand over there, and then after that I think we've got one up here as well.
Thank you. Vince Wilson's my name. I'm the CEO of a community service organisation, a very small housing provider as a component of that, based in Mildura in rural Victoria or regional Victoria. My question was triggered by David's presentation, but very much welcome thoughts of everyone on the panel. That question of procurement and how it plays with the drivers of good design and planning, and certainly, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we resolve this tension that does exist between dollar value and ultimate value in terms of those outcomes we're looking for. Certainly as a community housing provider, and I preface this comment by saying we value and love our colleagues in Victorian Government that fund us to build housing. But we get into these funding rounds and it's not us or our project managers that are driving a dollar versus a design. It's actually the different parts of government that are involved in the procurement process that are kind of pulling us from pillar to post on design this but get this dollar outcome. I'm interested in how we try to resolve some of that tension, and obviously you can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, the money doesn't matter anymore. We've got to have dollar value for value there. But how do we kind of maybe improve or reduce the tension around that procurement aspect?
Who wants to jump in on that?
I'm happy to kick it off. I mean, it's important because there's a need for government to be a smart client, and often it's not, and you need that capability and capacity, and I absolutely agree with you. I think the best approach you can take is to look at it and think about, well, let's get the best designers, let's procure the best design services possible for the housing that we're seeking to deliver. And, if government's not going to meet you halfway around the costing issues, then government needs to educate itself as to what it costs per square metre to build a house or a dwelling, however you want to define that. And I think that's a key challenge. We speak to our colleagues within Housing Victoria who know that Department of Treasury and Finance have some kind of loose ethereal figure that sits behind the square metre rate for delivering housing of, sometimes I've heard in the order of 2,500 square metres, which is just unrealistic in this current market, coupled with inflation. So I think finding the design champions within government who understand where you're coming from, but also taking on the responsibility yourself to get the best designers on the table. Because if that happens, then entities like our office can champion those particular projects and say that they're worthy of getting the funding they deserve.
Yeah, a planning perspective maybe as well. Just, I would say at the moment, not that everything's on the table, because what we're saying is that everything can be on the table when it goes through a, consideration of the outcome. But I think the appetite is there at the moment for bolder ideas, or pushing the envelope on, what you need to do to get a little bit more out of a site that is actually going to satisfy the ultimate, feasibility, is more palatable now because it's going to result in a home than maybe it was before when they just say, nah, try again later. So I just think everyone's got to keep challenging each other and innovating and pushing the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce what you said, because when it comes down to what the community cares about is character, not really the numbers of yields and densities. And as we haven't touched on it much yet, but as we realise that dwellings can be smaller, we can actually do a few more, and it affects the feasibility, and that's exactly what unlocks the opportunity for design. And this is where I've really found a great deal of that formula is trading off that sometimes the commodity figures for that amenity delight.
Yeah. And I think you've got the evidence now, household size is declining. Everyone accepts that. Growth is skyrocketing, household size is declining, so we need more smaller dwellings. And if you can sort of demonstrate how you're meeting that challenge, I think that helps.
I think we had another question just near that one, and then where was the other one? Up here. Okay, great. Thanks. Can we get a mic over here while that question there is being asked as well? Oh, and there's one up there as well. Okay. Let's go with this one first because you're ready. Thanks.
Cheers, thank you. Julie Saunders, I'm a director at Urbis, and I work in the policy and strategic advisory space in social and affordable housing, but I also chair the panel that Amy's mentioned there, which is the Housing Supply Expert panel here in Queensland. I just wanted to touch on, and I won't ask you around that contestable discussion of defining affordable housing, but I'm interested to hear the perspectives of the panel, particularly from different jurisdictions, around how we ensure enduring affordability, particularly, as Amy has mentioned, where the majority of the delivery of housing sits in the private market space, and particularly with a lot of the levers and mechanisms we're going to see and the funding arrangements, we will have a strong push into the affordable space from the private sector. So interested to hear and understand a bit more around how do we ensure enduring affordability.
Thank you. Great question. John, do you want to kick off on that one?
Thank you very much for the question, Julie. We have seen, there is a live debate happening in terms of the private delivery of affordable housing through mandatory inclusionary zoning schemes or incentives about whether or not affordable housing is in perpetuity or whether it's for 15 years. I look at the examples of NRAS where gradually you go beyond 15 years and the funding runs out. Now clearly there's a residual value of housing units after 15 or 10 years, and that has to be taken into account in developing what's on offer in a mandatory inclusionary zoning or an incentive. But it talks to a bigger question about how much we're prepared to pay as a community to provide affordable housing. And we've got a situation with greater and greater numbers of people not just creating a welfare challenge, but a productivity challenge for the core functioning of our cities. And we do have to invest in more housing for a longer period of time. And we need to get more sophisticated with our metrics. Maybe it's some sort of metric around affordable housing years, because at any one time in the housing marketplace, there's affordable housing that might be available in perpetuity. There might be some that are on 5, 10, 15-year timetables. Maybe we need a metric to keep tabs on the supply of this stuff. But I'm shooting all around your question, and thank you for it. And I also acknowledge that our affordable housing definitions are all over the place, and then there's the implications of our different definitions. One of the obvious ones is that there's an increasingly big gap between that part of the market that benefits from social housing and a big jump up to whatever the definitions are for affordable housing that are sort of more centred towards the middle of the market. So you're certainly correct in diagnosing the problem.
I'd like to jump in and also say something a little bit quite different, which is to ensure affordable housing is to ensure more housing ownership. So, but at the same time, and I heard on the news this morning how, you know, there is mortgage stress, there's no doubt about that, but what I think might help there is right-size housing. So if you're able to own a house that's virtually got a mortgage equal to the rent that you would be able to get, your leased rent that you would be able to get outside of home ownership, and that's your starting position, you probably will have that house security, that home ownership security for life. When the reach is too big and the house is maybe, you know, I'm kind of advocating less is more in terms of if we build less size of houses, we can build more, and more of us can be in the ownership situation of those houses. So one of my answers to that is if we can somehow tweak the regulations, the sizes, the builds, the designs to get more home ownership, we do have enduring affordability.
Tess, I'd love to
Yeah,
hear you
I'll just
speak.
say, looking abroad, in Cambridge, in Boston, Cambridge Council, encourage you, if anyone has the inclination, to look it up, but the Harvard School of Housing did a good session on it. But essentially what happened in Cambridge is, if you think about it, it's, you know, where all the unis are, and incredibly well educated, incredibly well off, and the affordability got so unaffordability, I should say, got so extreme that basically they had to do something, and it pushed the local councillors to bring in an affordable housing overlay. What does that mean? It means in perpetuity, community housing providers basically get access to all of this raft of incentives that the private market doesn't get. And it did have a capital injection up front to sort of get that sector firing, but basically it set them up and they can build more, faster, easier, and keep it, as long as it's kept in perpetuity, as affordable. So I think we do have a lot to look abroad at people who've gotten further down the housing crisis path a bit and where they ended up, and bring those lessons back here.
Can I press you a little bit further to talk about where the Queensland Government's at now in its thinking, and how you're defining affordable housing as distinct from social housing and market housing?
Yeah, so obviously we have a new Department of Housing, which is very exciting, and the charter there is about both social and affordable, noting that, of course, the Queensland Government can't own the entire affordable task in and of itself, because, as I spoke about before, the increasing nature of that marginalised median cohort is growing so much that, you know, it needs systemic changes from private, public, everyone to address it. So I think what we're doing, we've looked at inclusionary planning. You know, there's a range of actions that out of the Queensland Housing Summit that the government is looking at to find what a solution that's actually going to work here. Inclusionary planning is hotly contested. You know, you'll get every single view possible about its benefit, and I guess we're interrogating in a Queensland context with our market at the moment exactly how much of a lever it would be in and of itself, but then doing everything. We're just doing lots of different things at once, including the bill yesterday and the design series, and trying lots of things.
Yeah, a lot going on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tess. We had a question over here, and then there was another one over there after that. So we'll grab this one first. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Heather Shearer from Griffith University. I just had a question that's actually related to design, procurement and planning. And this is mostly aimed at Tess, sorry. Brisbane, as you probably know, has a very large proportion of detached dwellings. I think it's about 84% or so. And planning increasingly has sort of like reduced side setbacks. So you get these like microscopic side setbacks where you can touch the house next door just about. But the 6 metre setback to the road from the property boundary is almost sacrosanct. And I know that comes from Queensland state government and not from the councils. And it seems to be sort of anti the whole idea of well located, because it seems, to me, favours car-dependent suburbs. And it constrains, for example, infill of things like granny flats, for example, so that one could build a granny flat down the side of a slope because Queensland's pretty heady. that's got no shade, nothing, yet there's 12 metres or something of beautiful, magnificent driveway or something which would be perfectly able to build and probably would get rid of a lot of issues with complaints about infill. And also, just to mention what Amy said, which I agree with, we also need to have better design for multi-generational and group living.
Yeah.
So maybe 2 kitchens, 3 bathrooms and such like.
Thank you. Yeah, front yards.
I can comment. You might have Sydney, I don't know, other views as well, but just broadly, yes, that is a distinctly Queensland trait that came out of, the Undue Subdivision Act and various things a long time ago in our state. I lived in Fitzroy for 5 years and, didn't have a car park, didn't have, was on the street essentially, so I get it. It's a weird thing, but I guess it's about the car, so you can park the car there and amenity. It's become part of our street, a wider street. But certainly from our perspective, as I said before, we have to make land do more. You're right, that includes the front yard and the driveway from our perspective. And so we're working with that code, I guess, is looking at not just the detached house, but pushing the gentle density about maximising the whole site. So I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up the front setback, because it was on my list, but I hadn't got to it. But I think it's one of the most, the biggest opportunities for getting that well located. And just to circle back to inclusionary zoning, I'd like to just bypass that, but talk about no more exclusionary zoning, which are borrowed from Martin Gard, and basically look at no places where you can only do a single dwelling house, because in actual fact every place should be a village. And even if we do have to stress beyond the urban footprints and go into greenfield areas, we should almost have a minimum density requirement there should always be a village, and there should be very compact little nuggets of density even as we expand. But that front setback, yes, it's great to let's interrogate that and get rid of those walls that tend to block off those beautiful front yards because they're so big and nobody knows what to do with them, and just have them filled with gardens like the ones in Melbourne.
There's a question here. Have you got a microphone? No. Oh, there, sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Peter McMillan from NT We had an article in our NT News, I think it was just as recently as last week, that said developers have no excuses. The people have spoken in research that they've done that in terms of what the community wants for their community in terms of amenity, access to transport, jobs, all those things. But having key workers and social and affordable housing tenants next to them was certainly not on their priority list. So I'm wondering, from a design and planning perspective, how we can have a conversation that's mature in our communities that says, well, the housing is coming. We can do this well. We can do it in a way that doesn't necessarily mean your land values or your house values are going to decline when you have social housing tenants. But I guess more importantly, how can we instill belief in our communities that we can design villages or communities that have great amenity, great social cohesion, where we can have people on lower, moderate incomes living in harmony with people who are paying normal market rents and home ownership?
John?
Thank you for the question. And it brings to mind, and it's interesting that you're getting that feedback from Northern Territory. It brings to mind the notion of how do we have a sort of a new bargain around how do we get a livability dividend from growth? What are we prepared to invest as a community in investing in the amenity, the types of housing we need, the types of supporting infrastructure and services we need to build the communities that are able to accommodate the substantial changes in growth in our housing that we face. And I think we need a paradigm shift in the way we talk about this, because so much more growth is going to be occurring in existing urban areas, sure, but not just in existing urban areas, because a lot of our brownfield industrial sites have gone now. They're now housing. It's going to be putting housing where housing already is, where people already live. And it's It's how do we do this sort of growth? We're actually mucking with people where they already live, and how do we do that in a way that expresses a new deal where we do gentle density, but how do we do it more inclusively, where there's a grand bargain around what types of housing do we need, what types of incomes and jobs do we need and households do we need to accommodate, how much are we going to invest in social and affordable housing, how much are we going to invest in great planning, great amenity, so that we achieve a livability dividend from growth, and that we can express that this is growth that comes with something else. It comes with a package of a more inclusive community. I like to call it inclusive renewal. But we need to frame what that deal is, and we need to pay for that deal and plan for that deal. I can see Dr. Sue Holliday in the audience. She knows very well the dimensions of that sort of deal in Ultimo Piemonte, the Building Better Cities program, the work on mandatory inclusion rezoning, substantial public investment in a range of infrastructure and services to create a total solution for an area that had stated outcomes and had a degree of local, state and indeed community accountability for achieving a dividend from growth. I think we need to start thinking about different places that have existing communities that are going to be subject to substantial growth pressures, and resolving, what's the grand bargain here to accept that growth inclusively? What are the implications on a net loss? Certainly we don't want a net loss of affordable housing. How do we avoid a net loss of affordable housing in the face of growth, which might result in a substantial number of expensive new apartments or dwellings? How do we ensure that these places remain a social mix? How do we ensure that they offer a livability dividend? And as a planner, they're the sorts of conversations that we need to have and want to have as we roll out our next generation of strategic plans, whether it be in Darwin or anywhere else.
Thanks. I want to go to a question from the virtual audience as well now. This is on the issue, I guess, of planning, development, assessment and approval processes. The question asks about the role or potential role of AI in those processes, and I guess that points to a broader conversation about the use of plan tech and big data and other things in planning. Any thoughts on that, Tess?
Yes. Are you across digital twin from a Victorian point of view? That's probably the best example. Essentially, I'd say that I think, personally, there is a role to utilise tech to do the things that we know we want, that comply, and then our collective, efforts as a profession of design and planning is focused on the not so easy ones, where we want to work and adjust and find a way to get the outcome. So sort of deem to comply sometimes on things and make that happen as efficiently as possible, but certainly I don't think you can AI, people, ultimately, which is what place is about. So we have to keep that.
Can I just add that I can't see a future where we're not submitting applications in 3 dimensions and then looking at an existing 3-dimensional digital twin and interrogating the fit. The digital twin will be informed by what's there at the moment, but also about what our priorities are and our strategic planning and design priorities are going forward, and will enable us to test scenarios for how best to meet those design and strategic outcomes. And we've got to remember that the digital code that gets plugged into any AI or any machine-based assessment of a DA is only as good as the designing outcomes that we believe we want as humans. And that's the same with any planning control. Any planning control is just a translation of some vision for what we want for a place. So while it's inevitable that we'll be considering and using AI to determine conformance, it's conformance with what? It's conformance with what we judge is in our best interests as humans in a place.
Thanks. I think I promised someone over here a question. Sorry, it's really hard for me to see over the lights. Down here, thank you.
Hi, sorry, I thought I was going to do damage to my rotor cuff there. But no, look, very, very, I think, high-level and intelligent conversation going on. Look, my name's Deb Lee, Deb King, from First Peoples Disability Network and the New South Wales Coalition of Aboriginal Peaks. Look, one of the things I'm just going to make comment, because it still continues to fall short of, I think a lot of people's thinking here. But when we're discussing inclusivity versus exclusivity, we need to also discuss the impacts of stigmatisation and how that creates a silent level of disadvantage. So my question is, even though Queensland, in my opinion, from what we've heard at the conference, is very much a front runner, very forward-thinking as a state, is it remiss of me to actually call the governments out here, every state across this nation, and say, we have no accessible disability data that is forthcoming or even transparent. So how do we as a nation design for a response? Because what I'm hearing is, if we have 200 mob there living with disability, and whether it's Cairns, whether it's Tennant Creek, doesn't matter where it is, we don't actually have the data the government continues to tell us. Now, this is a fight that we have known for many years, and it's also been the pinnacle point of that deliberate or discrete disadvantage that continues to occur. So my question would be this: Tess, really applaud your thinking, but again, if we don't have accessible and transparent data for mob living with a disability, this conversation, to me, I'll be coming back in 20 years' time and we'll still be trying to address it.
Tess, obviously that's for you.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I hear what you're saying. All I can say is that I do think the government is looking at data in many forms, including what you're talking about, and that we have to have the evidence on the table that everyone can see, a single point of evidence, and that applies to the housing numbers, all of these things that we're all talking about, including disability in First Nations communities, in order to be able to, see the problem, address the problem. So I'm very happy to take back your comments to my colleagues in the right parts of department, but I guess data is important to all of us in everything we're doing. Agree.
Thank you, and thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just, sorry, I did hear, and I'll just reframe that. Just a comment that there needs to be that understanding of the discrete disabilities involved here, and the fact that many of the people that are being discussed here, and sorry, I just forgot your name, but are not necessarily even using the word disability, so we need to sort of, dig a bit deeper to really understand the need there. So thank you, appreciate that. We just had, I think, one more question here, and then we will need to wrap this up. So,
yeah, good morning. I'm Drew Brook, consumer rep and lived experience expert from WA. Glad to hear the discussion around setbacks. WA also suffers from a 7-metre setback rule, which seems bizarre in this current time. My question, however, was around policy planning and maybe some legalities around that. I consult for a large charity in Western Australia who have some beautiful land donated by a really generous benefactor in the mid-1900s, I think. So the demographic that it was stipulated for doesn't really exist anymore, isn't appropriate, and the benefactor has no relatives, and it's very difficult to get that shifted to another demographic that's in need now. Any suggestions around how to feed back a way to get that approved for planning that isn't for a irrelevant demographic?
I can only comment that I can't think of a demographic that isn't affected by housing crises of different types at the moment.
You might.
I'll just put out there that innovation, disruption, design. I'm a good one for finding a solution, design solution somehow for legal problems and planning problems. So I think maybe a workshop or something where you might just look to different places for your solutions. But I must say I did have on my list, tenure, types of tenure, and Aboriginal communities sometimes have deeds of trust. Those present similar problems. And as we're doing more house sharing, and thank you to the Queensland Government for facilitating some house sharing with dignity, where we now have the definition of household is different and secondary dwellings are more accepted. We now need to interrogate maybe the types of tenure of tenants in common, because how does that become sort of a security of your home as well? So innovation.
Thank you. Look, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for being here, participating and asking those questions. We're about to break for morning tea, but please just join with me in thanking our panellists, John, David, Tess and Amy. Thank you.